All right, let's get started with the demo for using modifiers when building practical scenes and objects. So for this demonstration, I'm gonna do some columns. I'm gonna be doing Doric columns, which if you're not familiar with them, they're these sort of Greek style columns, but they have these simple bases and tops. Not some of this would not be a Doric column. So not with these sort of floral details, with these sort of straight geometrical details. So let's get started with that. So we're going to start by adding a cube to our scene, or using the default cube if that's what you have up. And now let's start by making our base. So I'm going to tab into edit mode, and I'm going to briefly turn on grid snapping, just so when I move this face by hitting G and then Z, it's going to snap exactly to this x-axis line, which we are using as our floor plane. So now let's turn that off and grab this face and bring this down pretty low here. So now I want to prep this for use with the mirror modifier. And actually, these columns are symmetrical both in the X direction and in the Y direction. So I really only need to model a quarter of it. And I'm going to model this quarter of it that is in the front right part of the mesh, because it will make it easier to view when snapping to the orthographic views with our shortcuts. So let's prep this for a mirror modifier by, in edit mode, adding some loop cuts, or you can simply select A and subdivide this once. All right, so now we have all the points that we need in order to define this front corner. So let's select all the other points that do not define this corner, press X and delete them. Okay, so now we just have this front corner. I did subdivide this face, but we can leave that. We'll use that geometry. That is open in the middle, and we do want to leave it open in the middle because we're going to close it with a mirror modifier. So in the modifier properties panel, come in, add modifier, and add a mirror. Now it's defaulted it to mirror across the X, which we do want, but we also want it to mirror across the Y. So just add the Y to that. And we can go ahead and turn on clipping for this because we do not want to create any holes along these lines. Okay, so let's start adding a little bit of detail to this. I'm going to actually lower this down a little bit and scale it in, because I want to create sort of a little lip at the very bottom. I'm going to extrude this up and maybe inset it again. And I want to talk a little bit about inset with the mirror modifier. So when I inset this, it's only insetting this face, but I can change how this inset is performed on a mirror modifier by pressing B on the keyboard, which will turn off boundary. I believe it is currently off. Yes, it'll turn off boundary. So basically, when you have something like a mirror modifier on and you inset with a boundary on, it's recognizing this as the boundary of the mesh that you're insetting. So you would end up with four, little extrusions rather than one large one in the center. So we have to do is when we inset it, hit B for boundary and bring it in, or enable boundary right here in the inset faces menu. All right, and we can always scale this. If we lock the Z value, we can adjust this value. Okay, let's extrude one more time. It's looking pretty good. It's a good start anyway. We can add, some detail to this if we like. Just add a couple loop cuts and maybe extrude these in. I'm hitting Shift Z after I press S, so it doesn't change the height of these faces. I want them scaled in exactly at their same height. And you can actually scale them down a little bit in the Z. I still had to lock the Z value because when you scaled it that way, it would probably not scale properly, but I just scaled these faces down a little bit in the Z so that when you're viewing it from an orthographic view, you can see this edge. Normally it would just sort of disappear the way this one has. So we can fix that edge as well. Let's grab the edge loop by pressing Alt and clicking, grabbing in the X and just moving it up. And now when we view it in orthographic mode, we can now see this edge again. And we can do that for all of these, or we can use things like bevels. So we can grab this edge, we can hit Shift B and bevel it a little bit. And now in orthographic view, now we can see this edge much more clearly. Let's put a bevel here as well. And let's just scale this up a little. I want it a little bit higher. Okay. So that's a good start for our base. Now let's move on to the column portion, and the column portion is going to be a cylinder. So I'm going to keep these objects separate for now, and then we can merge them when we're happy with how it looks. So let's add a cylinder. Shift A, cylinder. And scale this a bit. I currently have my my transform pivot set to 3D cursor, which is why it's, when I'm scaling it, it's coming into this point instead of into this point. Let's actually change that back to median for the time being, just so we can get the width of this right. Move it up. And let's change the height of this, either by scaling it and moving it, or by coming into edit mode and just moving the top face. And let's say about there. And now if you look at images of these columns, a lot of times they will usually, the top will be slightly thinner than the bottom. So let's just scale that in a little bit. All right. It's a pretty good start. I think I actually want to add a little bit more detail to the bottom, just so this transition isn't quite so stark. Because if you're looking at reference pictures on the other screen, they do have sort of some, you know, extrusions and things around the round part as well before you get into the main column portion. So let's just bring the bottom up a little bit and extrude it, scale it, bring it down a little bit so it's not quite so harsh, extrude it. Let's do an extrude and a scale. And extrude and just straight down, extrude into scale. Let's bring this down a little and let's extrude straight down. I do want to make sure that the widest point of this column is the bottom, just for visual reasons. I'm not following any particular design on this. I just kind of have a Google image search of Doric columns, and I'm looking at sort of all of them and getting an idea for what types of things you typically see in these columns. So let's delete this bottom face because we're never going to see it. It's just taking up memory on our computer. And the same is actually true for the top face. So now I can shade this whole thing smooth and it should look proper. I want to smooth out some of these curves a bit. So I'm just going to do that by grabbing these edge loops and beveling them. I can repeat a bevel of the exact same width by hitting Shift and R. And Shift and R. Okay. Another bevel, a smaller bevel for these sort of interior cuts. Tabbing in and out of edit mode so I can see how it looks. Tabbing back in to fix anything that needs to be fixed. Okay, that looks pretty good. So we actually want to do the same thing basically up top, but rather than just repeating it and trying to get it as even as possible, we can use a mirror modifier for this. So let's divide this mesh in half. And since we know that this is the exact halfway point, because between this point and this point, because Blender will always add a loop cut exactly at the halfway point, let's snap our origin to this because it's going to be our line of symmetry. So this should all be reviewed, but to snap the origin, Shift S, cursor to selected, tab into edit mode, right click, set origin, origin to 3D cursor. Great, so now we have our origin right here. So if we were to come back into edit mode, select this top circle of vertices, delete them. And now in the modifiers panel, we're going to add a modifier of a mirror to the stack. We're going to disable the X mirror because we have our X information. We actually have all of our X and Y information. We're just going to enable it on the Z. So coming back into object mode, you'll see it's mirroring the bottom piece to the top, and I didn't have to redo those extrusions and bevels. Now, if I wanted to mirror this, let's say I want the base of this is going to be exactly the same as the top. We can do this also with a mirror modifier. So let's collapse this modifier. We still need it, so we're not going to get rid of it, but we're just going to add another mirror modifier to this. So let's just add a mirror modifier. By default, it's on X, which we do not want. We want it on Z because we want to mirror it on the up and down direction. Enable Z, but you'll see that because the pivot is at the bottom here, it is flipping it down into the negative. So it's essentially flipping this underground, and we want it flipped up here. Now we can do this, we can move this origin up into this point, but we don't have to do that because we already have this piece whose origin is right here. So instead, we're going to use the mirror object option in the mirror modifier. So on our base piece, we're going to come into the second mirror modifier we have, and we can rename these. We can call this like XY modifier, this first one, because it is the one that we have that's creating this entire base from just this corner along the X and the Y axes. We can call this like top bottom modifier. Renaming it will do nothing to the modifier. It's just if you have a lot in your stack, helps you keep them organized. So let's use the mirror object. So what that's going to do, it's going to take this object and flip it based on the pivot of another object, which is exactly what we want. So in mirror object, either select it from the drop down or hit the eyedropper icon, select the object, and now you'll see that this is being mirrored perfectly on the Z axis around this object. Moving this object will move the way it is mirrored. So you'll see that really the only mesh data we have is this cylinder and this corner of the base, but with modifiers, we've created the entire column. So I want to add the sort of indents to this before we move on to joining it, before we finalize this. So we can do this And actually, this mesh is also symmetrical all the way around, so we don't actually even need this section. We can delete these vertices. We can add a second mirror modifier, and I'm going to drag it to the top just because that's how I like to organize my modifiers. I like to do anything that's like a piece of one mesh, like anything that would essentially need clipping turned on, in the stack above the pieces that are like being mirrored around other objects. That's just a personal preference and like an organizational thing. And we can delete the back as well. So we just have now this corner. So let's enable X and Y on this first mirror modifier. And so now really all our mesh data is this strip of mesh without modifiers on these objects. This is all we have in our scene, really. So you can just really see how powerful modifiers are for really quickly fleshing out objects and scenes. So let's turn that back on. And let's make sure, yes, clipping is enabled. So I'm going to add one edge loop right here to sort of protect these edges. And I'm going to select 1, 2, 3, 4 of these. And I'm not going to select them on the line of symmetry because I'm about to bevel these edges. And if you try to bevel an edge that is on a line of symmetry, it won't work. So let's Control B and bevel this. So now the bevels are there. If we extrude and scale this on not the Z, Shift Z, bring it in. Now this is a little messed up because I had my transform pivot set to median, so it's only looking at this quarter. So let's just set it back to 3D cursor. And do we have this extrusion? So, okay, good. Just making sure I didn't create any duplicates by moving those around. So now when we extrude along the X and Y, it should come in exactly to the center. Now this looks a little funky and there's a number of reasons, and it's mostly just shading. We do have to come in, however, and delete these sort of artifact faces. No problem, just delete them. So now we really need to fix the shading on this. And I think the way I'm going to do this is by selecting these, shading them flat. So you'll see with these shaded flat, and you can see it on the center one most of all, it's just fixed some of these shading issues, and it's easier to see this sort of extrusion part. So you can see that if we had every face on here, like that we were modeling with mesh, this would take a long time, but we only have to do a quarter of it, and so the mirror modifier really speeds that up. Okay, look at this. Now we just need to fix the shading on the bottom. And I believe these ones should be flat as well. Let's just select all of these and shade flat. Still having some artifacts. We can fix those in a bit though. So let's say we're happy with the appearance of this column. I'm just going to show you that. I believe I went over this in a previous video. I'm going to fix this shading really quick by hitting A to select everything, hitting Alt-N, and pressing Reset Vectors. It's going to highlight some of these edges for you in blue. And all that means is Blender sees this is a sharp edge, so this edge needs to be shaded as sharp. And sometimes you want this, sometimes you don't. You can always come in afterwards and change these back to smooth shading. Select the edge right click in edge select mode or come up to the edge select menu, just do clear sharp, and that will shade that back to smooth. So you'll see that the reset vectors has fixed all the issues we were having here, but it incorrectly assumed that we wanted sharp edges here. So we just have to come in and clear them. And we can make an edge sharp ourselves by, in edge select mode, selecting our edges, right clicking, and hitting mark sharp. Okay, so that's looking a lot better. So let's say we're happy with this. Now, because we have the same modifier stack on both these objects, we actually wouldn't have any issues if we were to join them. However, if one of these did not have one of these exact modifiers that are being modified in the same way across the X and Y and then across the Z, you might get some issues. And we might even get some issues because our base is using our cylinder. So I believe that if we join them, these will, looks okay. So all that it's done now is that it's cleared the mirror object because that object no longer exists anymore because we joined it. But just know that if you are trying to join two objects together that have different modifiers in the stack, but you want it to appear exactly as it does in the viewport, the way to do that would just be to first apply the modifiers and then join them. So you would just hit the down arrow and apply, or Control A to apply each of your modifiers, and you want to apply the top one first and then the bottom one, as we discussed when we discussed the modifier stack order. And then you would join those objects after you have applied all the modifiers on all the separate objects. But I'm going to leave these because they have the exact same modifiers. It's not causing any issues, and I think it just creates a smoother, more flexible workflow when you leave your modifiers. All right. So we have one column here. Now we can use some more modifiers to flesh this out even more. So let's say we wanted, some sort of Greek temple or something like that. So we're going to need a lot of columns. So let's make, let's duplicate our column here, but we're going to do it with modifiers. So I'm first just going to move this over a little bit. And then I'm going to this, let's rename this really quick. To this column object, I'm going to add to my modifier stack an array modifier. So right now it has a relative offset of 1, so there's no gap right here. They're being drawn exactly next to each other. But we can just increase this slider to move this over. Great. And now if we increase the count, every subsequent column we place will have that same exact distance. So we can increase and decrease these sliders to get roughly the look we want. I do want an even number, I believe, because I want to be able to place like a door or something right there. These columns would obviously be holding up some sort of roof. So let's add that now. We can press Shift and C to reset our 3D cursor just so it's in the center again. We're gonna add a cube. Gonna move it up. Scale this a little bit in the X. I'm just changing that pivot point back to median, which is the default. I'm gonna place these as close as we can here. Scale it. Now I'm trying to place these exactly in the center by looking at these, but that's a very inaccurate way to do this. So what I actually probably should be doing is, instead of making an array of 6, I should be making an array of 3, making my placement on this side, and adding even another mirror modifier. But we're going to use this mesh cube object as our point of symmetry. So if we add cube into this, it's just going to flip it and it's going to be exact. And if I change the width of this at any point, it will mirror perfectly. So you can see that you can quickly get a lot of modifiers going in your stack, but it makes your models really flexible while you're working with them. Okay, so I have this the width I wanted. I'm going to come back to this piece in just a second. I first want to flesh out more of the base of this. I'm thinking like, like an ancient Greek temple sort of thing. So let's add this, a new cube, tab into edit mode, briefly turn on snapping so that it's perfectly flush with the floor. Turn off snapping, tab out of edit mode to have our pivot move with us. Let's move it back, let's scale it up, and with the pivot at the bottom, it's going to stay there. It's really nice. So that's a little too high, obviously. Let's scale it to about there. Next, scale it out. And we want to, from the top view, make it, it doesn't have to be square perfectly. It can be a little bit rectangular. Okay, that looks pretty good. That's sort of the interior base, like where this would be like a door in here, and this would be the actual interior of the building. So we can add a door, and we can do that with the Boolean modifier. I'm gonna hide this cube just for right now. And I'm gonna leave these up for reference, and then we'll probably hide them in a moment. So let's rename this to like building or something like that. And now we're gonna cut in a door here. So we're gonna add another cube, and we're gonna scale it, just looking at these columns, not looking at real world values. We're just gonna scale it to what we think roughly a door should look like for a building of this size. I think that looks about good. I'm going to inset this back so it is intersecting with this main building structure of what these walls are. And now, instead of just kind of sticking this cube onto the front of this wall segment the way that we have been doing in the past, we are now going to use a Boolean modifier to cut in a doorway. So we're going to select our building mesh, and let's rename this something like bool underscore door, just so it's easier to find. Now let's add a modifier here, and we're going to add a Boolean. So our Boolean object is going to be our door. Select it. And now if we hide this object, we now have this indent here. There we go. All right. I'm just thinking about the order in which I want to approach these things. Sometimes, for certain objects, the order really matters. For other things, it's up to you. I think what I want to do is I'm going to apply this Boolean modifier because I'm satisfied with this. And I'm looking at some references. I just Googled Greek temple, and I'm looking at some references, and it doesn't look like this interior section really has many windows in most of these. It just has a door from what I can see for most of them. I'm sure some of them have windows. And it's up to you. If you decide you want windows in yours, the same operation with this, you just add a Boolean, call it, a cube, size it the way you want it, call it, Boolean underscore window, place them where you want them, and then add another Boolean for the modifier stack. Or alternatively, you could, in edit mode, duplicate this and, scale it to be a window size. And now this is all one object. So this Boolean modifier is still referencing this object. So if we hide it, you'll see it now has a door and a window cut in because it is all one object. So there's a couple different ways to do things. And since I have these windows, let's just add them on the front. Actually, don't like that one. We're just going to add maybe 3 here. And you'll see in wireframe with the Boolean modifier turned on, there's these cuts that are coming across. It's just kind of telling you where it's going to draw these new edges to connect with these vertices. Okay, let's hide our Boolean object. Great. And you can do as many as you like, go all the way around, whatever you like. We are going to go all the way around, just maybe not with the windows. So let's return to this because you might be wondering what I'm planning on doing with it. So let's see how this is lined up. In the z-axis, yeah, okay, so we're going to extend this out, so we don't actually need this top face. So let's delete it. And so we have just sort of an empty box here. And you can see sort of the interior of the indents we made with the Boolean modifier. Let's tab into edit mode on this, which is going to be the roof piece, and just grab it, drag it out. All right. So let's see. It is approximately 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 centimeters out from this wall is this edge. Let's just check the side. So it's 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 should be about here. So I'm going to drag it out to about there. We're going to Shift D and duplicate these along the Y and place them. And if you're wondering, oh, couldn't I use a mirror modifier around this object? Absolutely. And maybe we should, since this is supposed to be a mirror modifier demo. But once again, just proving that there is more than one way to model something in Blender. So I've just added another mirror modifier to the stack. Let's call this start naming some of these, front, back. And then if you ever forget what an individual modifier in your stack does, just disable the viewport visibility and you'd be like, oh, this one is the left, right. The array, we kind of know what the array does. It's only the only array. This is, let's call this local underscore top bottom. And I'm calling it local because what I mean by that in this case is that I'm mirroring this locally to create an object, and then these mirrors down lower in the stack are for mirroring to duplicate that object. So this one is local XY, yes. Local underscore XY. And that's just going to help me keep track of what each of these is doing in the stack. All right. So let's actually come into top view here. See, this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, about 5 from the edge. So let's duplicate, Shift D to duplicate this. And maybe come into wireframe so we can see where the boundaries are. 2, 3, 4, 5. So now I have these spaced approximately where they need to be. So I need to basically for this object that's been duplicated, I no longer want it running through, I want it running this way. So let's change our array to 0 in the X, and let's change it to -1. Let's change it to 1 in the Y, and then just slide it up. I think it was at, what is it at for this one? 3.4. Let's go 3.4 and reduce our count down to 2. And still, because this is not exactly square, we have a little bit of left over. So we're just gonna increase this relative factor on our array modifier until it looks approximately even. Looks pretty good. Okay, so we want to pitch this roof. And I'm going to do that with an extrusion. Because these roofs on these sort of Greek style temples have a portion where they just come straight up and then they pitch in after that. So let's extrude this face. And in fact, we can be using a mirror modifier on this one as well because it is exactly the same left and right. And mirror modifiers help keep things symmetrical. Let's grab this in on the X. Looks pretty good. So now these vertices are so close together, there's no point to having both of them. So let's box select, and you can come into wireframe to box select to make sure that you're getting them both. Just make sure there's no actual geometry behind them. You see, obviously I cannot select something that's just being produced as part of a mirror modifier, and also it's in a separate object. So M at center, M at center. Okay. So I'm not going to spend too much longer on this. The demonstration's getting sort of long, but we're almost done. So let's just push through. All I've done is inset this face with I and moved it up a little. I'm going to hit E to extrude it, bring it in. I'm going to delete this sort of artifact face that's created between them from the mirror modifier. Create that inset edge and scale it in ever so slightly just so that we can see it from the front better. Oops. And I did not have clipping turned on for this, so it created a hole. So I'm just Control-Zing to undo it, enable clipping, and scale it again. Cool. Let's create a quick base for this. Another cube. Going to tab into edit mode, briefly turn on snapping. I'm actually going to put this at the top because I want it to come down. And I'm going to grab that and make it, oh, I don't know, 0.5, 50 centimeters. Okay, so now we need to scale this on the X and maybe bring it forward a little bit on the Y without snapping enabled. I'm just trying to create sort of an edge, something that sticks out a little bit, and I'm going a little bit quicker now because I'm trying to finish this, but you'll just see it's created like a little bit of a lip for these to sit on. We can create sort of a more, scale it like just a couple steps up to the foundation. Again, this is not architecturally accurate, but it does not need to be for our purposes. It looks pretty good. Now, I made this inset on the front and I forgot to make it on the back. Let's just duplicate it by cutting this mesh in half, deleting the back, and enabling Y on the mirror modifier, but we just need to move the pivot I think we could even do it that way. Yeah. So we didn't even need to move the pivot. We just added this building, this block part, as our object for our mirror object in the mirror modifier. So you can continue on with this, adding more detail, putting in the doors, things like that. But that is going to wrap up this demo for how to use modifiers when modeling an object. And I will see you in the next one.